Twice the diagnosis, twice the fun, right? In response to my most recent video on narcissism and autism, Mr. Daydreamer 1584 asks, if you have the comorbidity of ADHD like me, you may not relate to all this stuff on social deficits. Can you make a video on this? Meaning that if you're an AuDHDer, you might not feel like you relate to all the autistic traits in this category. I can confidently tell you there's a lot in this area I personally don't relate to as a result of having both conditions. Well, Mr. Daydreamer 1584, ask and ye shall receive. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jen, and on this channel I mainly talk about autism and ADHD. So if that's something you're interested in, you can hit those like and subscribe buttons. But if you don't, I have no way of knowing, so don't worry, you're not gonna personally hurt my feelings. So let's revisit some of the stats on this real quick. It's now estimated that 50 to 70% of individuals with ASD might also have the comorbidity of ADHD. So even at the lowest end, 1 in 2 people with autism might also have ADHD. The shorthand for this coexisting insanity is sometimes referred to as AuDhD, or at least that's what the cool kids are calling it. And if you're hearing about this for the first time, that might seem strange since the two conditions seem so opposite from one another, and in many areas, they are, but there are a lot of areas of crossover too. So in this video, we're going to answer Mr. Daydreamer's question and talk about one of the areas where you may not solely represent autism or ADHD, and that is in the social communication and interaction category, because you are a special little creature that is somewhere in between all of that. Here's how this video will be laid out. In the first half, I'm going to share what my own lived experience with this issue looks like. Basically, I'll be breaking down which traits from each I do have and which traits from each I don't have. And in the second half, we're going to examine what the scientific literature says about social deficits in AuDHD specifically. And I promise you're going to want to stick around for that because the findings were pretty surprising and may not be what you would expect. Now, before I get into my own traits, it's important to keep in mind that since I'm an AuDHD female, my experience with this might look different than yours if you're an AuDHD male, because females do tend to be more socially motivated even when they're on the spectrum, for some reason. And that the items your specific brand of AuDHD picks and chooses from the social deficits buffet might look different from mine. Now, in almost all the medical literature you read, you'll see social challenges called deficits. And I'm going to do my best to call them differences wherever possible, because that's what they are. Differences. However, I will still be using the terms deficits or impairments intermittently due to the nature of including such research articles. So, what are some of the social differences common in each condition? In the autism circle over here, we have difficulty with back and forth conversation, which can include struggling to gauge when it's their turn to talk, difficulty with small talk, understanding sarcasm, socially acceptable manners, difficulty in understanding nonverbal cues, reduced sharing of interests, and failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. And in the ADHD circle, we have poor listening skills, diminished attention span, and failure to focus on details for inattentive type, and talking excessively, difficulty waiting your turn, interrupting or intruding into conversations of others, impulsively blurting out answers before questions are completed, missing social cues, or withdrawing for hyperactive type. And if you have the combined type, you might have some or all of those. So if I were to smush these two circles together to show you what this looks like for me specifically as someone who has been diagnosed with both conditions, it would look something like this. And I swear, this looks like some kind of diagram, but can't quite put my finger on it. Anyway, as I go through these, I encourage you to think about what this diagram would look like for you if you put something like this together. As you can see, there's a lot of crossover. So at this point, you might be wondering how I could say I don't identify with a lot of the social differences associated with autism when I included almost every social trait associated with autism. But Let me explain. Well, the areas I don't struggle in aren't that numerous. They are items that have a pretty big impact on social perceptions in a way that makes me appear more socially adept. So much so that it's almost indistinguishable from a typically developed person, which carries its own problems because it means I'm still socially awkward enough that I don't quite fit in anywhere, and I definitely fall into that uncanny valley territory. People can absolutely tell there's something off about me, but they just can't quite put their fingers on it. But I'm just socially skilled enough that no one would believe I have neurological explanations for my differences or that I have any needs. So, for the autistic areas I don't struggle in, I'm actually really good at picking up on verbal or nonverbal social cues. Let me give you an example of this. There's this hilarious meme floating around referring to personality types of people in the Midwest here in America, where a person asks, "How do you politely tell your visitor that it's time to go home?" And one person responds, "If you're from the Midwest, you just say, 'Welp,' really forcefully and slap your knees with your hands, then stand up." Other Midwesterners will recognize the signal and say, "Suppose we should head out." Now, not only is that meme hilarious, it contains great examples of both verbal and nonverbal social cues that may not have been obvious. The guy didn't directly tell everyone to leave. He gave an indirect verbal cue by saying "welp" and an indirect nonverbal cue by forcefully slapping his knee. Many people on the spectrum may not have picked up on that, but I absolutely would have. Matter of fact, I'm almost overly sensitive to social cues in a way that's detrimental because I'm constantly looking for such signals in a way that makes me self-conscious. People on the spectrum may have difficulty in recognizing when others are disinterested in a subject they're talking about, but I can absolutely tell when someone's lost interest. I pick up on nonverbal cues like when someone starts looking away while I'm talking, or if they start getting fidgety, etc. I can even pivot to adjust by switching the topic or gracefully ending the conversation. I also have no problems knowing when it's my turn to talk, nor do I have problems with my manners or social graces. I can read the room and the individual people in it. I can decipher what they want to talk about, when to interject humor to keep the situation entertaining, or when to be serious. And I can and do force myself to make reciprocal conversation or ask related follow-up questions. And finally, I have no problems understanding sarcasm at all. If any of you know me by now, you know I very much enjoy having a sarcastic and deadpan sense of humor myself. So, why did I share all of this? Was it to brag about how socially awesome I am? I wish I was socially awesome. I shared all of that to show you that if you took just this one piece out of context and this was all you knew about me, you would probably say that there was no way I could be autistic. And for people to understand how imposter syndrome can become a confusing struggle for those of us who have both conditions when they don't meet major criteria like that. So now let's look at the areas I do struggle in. I do have difficulty with back and forth conversation, especially when it's not a topic of interest. If I am interested in the topic, then I gravitate towards monologuing or have difficulty not interrupting, but we'll get to that in the ADHD section. But the amount of internal effort I have to exert to force myself to have back and forth conversation on a non-preferred topic is exhausting. To an outsider, that sounds really selfish, but it's not. It's unfortunately just how my brain works. It refuses to absorb information about stuff it doesn't find interesting, which means I may not know what to contribute to the conversation, which gives me anxiety. And when I do finally figure out what to say, it can sometimes feel forced or ingenuine. And small talk. Small talk. A simple "How have you been?" can send my mind racing like I just got an unexpected pop quiz handed to me, which is dumb because I know me. I should have all the answers to how I'm doing, but I overthink it. Am I just supposed to say "good" and you, or is that dismissive? Maybe I should share about what's going on in my job or my health, or is that oversharing? Or maybe I should give them a bullet point version to recap my week in an effort to be more personable and relatable. Or do they literally mean "how are you feeling"? Because I have alexithymia, buddy, so that's not happening. You think I'm going to tell you how I feel when I can't even figure that out for myself? Or half the time, small talk is comprised of superficial stuff I don't give a crap about, like the sports balls or the weather. And I fail pretty miserably at initiating or responding to social interactions. If you want a more detailed account of what this looks like for me, I highly recommend you go back and check out one of the earlier videos I did on my social deficits. But if I were to go through all the text messages I have with my friends or family, the data would reflect that the number of times I initiate conversation is probably hovering at around 5%. And I hardly ever plan activities and invite people to them. Like, ew, why would you do that? Why would you plan something and ask people to come and do that thing with you on purpose? I mean, it's not that I've never done this, but my success rate with this one is about once every other year. And then there's my ADHD traits. Hello, ADHD. With as much as I talk about autism on my channel, believe it or not, I actually feel like my ADHD traits might be the most dominant. I think the reason I focus on autism traits so heavily, however, is because I feel like those contribute some heavier challenges, but I digress. In the ADHD camp, I have poor listening skills, diminished attention span, and attention to detail, which all kind of goes together. Much of this jumps in with that whole unpreferred topics issue, which again seems egocentric and like I don't feel like the other person is important enough to listen to. But believe me, I want to be interested in it. I wish my brain could be more even-keeled in this area. What I wouldn't give to be that person that is so personable and likable because I remember facts and details about others, but it's literally like oil and water to my brain. I have gone so far as to internally repeat word for word what someone is saying in a desperate attempt to force that information into my brain, like a toddler angrily trying to smash the star-shaped piece into the moon-shaped hole. And I have difficulty waiting my turn when it is a subject of interest. Containing myself and trying to be patient to share when someone brings up a topic that I actually want to talk about is like witnessing a dam slowly cracking. You know it's only a matter of time before the deluge cracks it wide open because the compromised structural integrity can't hold it in anymore. Talking excessively and withdrawing are both things I do too. My husband and I joke about how I'm all or nothing. I'm either talking 90 miles a minute like an auctioneer on
drugs,
or I'm silent and pensive. Now, withdrawing from the ADHD standpoint is probably due to inattention or lack of interest, but people with ASD do this too when they're overwhelmed or going into shutdown mode. And I saved my best ADHD trait for last because I absolutely impulsively blurt out answers or try to finish other people's
sandwiches.
The person on the receiving end of this the most is my poor husband, who, I'm lucky, is very, very patient with me. It's not at all uncommon that the people we feel most comfortable around are the ones that see the worst sides of us. So he gets to see the unmasked version of me the most, but if I know it's not kind to blurt out answers or impulsively finish sentences, then why do I do it? Because it's an impulse. It's like my brain is running in front of me and leaving me in the dust. My brain's trying to live in the future, and I'm here like, dang, slow down, brain. Let's just live in the present here. Relax and smell the roses. It's all gonna be okay. But my brain is like, nah, bro. Y'all need to jump into that time machine and catch up to me here in the future. Now, I have purposely used heavy cognitive efforts to fight this impulse. I'm not an animal, but when I do that, it looks a little something like this. I don't know, when he said that, it just made me feel so unimportant, dismissed, irritated, agitated, invalidated, angry. Don't say it, Jen. Don't say it, Jen. Be quiet. Be patient. Just let them get there. Good grief. They're taking so long to finish their sentence. 1, 2, 3, 4. Invalidated. I knew it. And the funny thing is, I'm completely hypocritical because it's hard for me when other people talk too slowly because they're processing their thoughts or they chase rabbits and don't stick to the point. When I myself talk slowly due to processing issues and I chase rabbits like it's my livelihood. However, all those things I just shared with you that I do experience, all of those things, I use compensatory strategies to hide as much as possible. So I basically have 2 categories of social differences, the ones I don't experience and the ones other people think I don't experience. Now, we're almost to the studies part about all of this. And like I said, you're going to want to stick around for that because the findings aren't what you might expect. But I just want to share a few more thoughts. First is that as I was parsing out these traits to figure out which ones I have and which ones I don't have, I had a revelation. Most of the stuff I don't struggle with are ineptitudes that probably couldn't be camouflaged by masking, even if you wanted to, because you either have the ability to pick up on social cues or you don't. You either have the ability to understand sarcasm or you don't. There's no masking to hide things you're just not capable of. It's like the saying, you can't know what you don't know. But all the other tendencies I shared, I would presume to say might be more subject to personal cognition and camouflaging, especially in high masking individuals. But how you experience me doesn't mean there's nothing wrong. For starters, I can usually only hold the mask up for a few hours. I used to attend professional conferences some time ago, and I would literally tell my employees, around 3 p.m., I'm gonna get real tired, but I never knew why that was. Since autism was nowhere on my radar at the time, I didn't realize this was because that was the point my mental muscles could no longer hold up the facade. Because constantly playing 4D chess while socializing is not only exhausting, but it takes a huge toll on our self-esteem and social identities. But my point
What's your point?
was that when you hear the autistic criteria saying over and over again that you shouldn't be able to pick up on social cues or you shouldn't be able to understand sarcasm, but you can, it can lead to imposter syndrome. My ADHD can actually make me seem extroverted and charismatic when on the inside I'm struggling with masking, exhaustion, and self-doubt, just like every other autistic. Now we've arrived to the actual data part. So let's look at what the scientific literature says about what social differences look like in these very distinct creatures we call AuDHDers. The article is titled, Do Communication and Social Interaction Skills Differ Across Youths Diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or dual diagnosis? And it reads, given the well-documented symptom overlap between ASD and ADHD, careful evaluation of differentiation and overlap is critical for accurate diagnostic decisions. Results provide the first evidence for use on the ADOS, distinguishing youth who have ADHD alone versus ASD alone, or co-occurring ASD and ADHD, characterizing the continuum of communication and social interaction profiles among individuals with ASD, ADHD, and ASD plus ADHD is not only relevant from a diagnostic and treatment perspective, but also critical for etiological research. So what all of this means is that they're looking into the overlap to be able to accurately diagnose ADHD alone, autism alone, or when someone has both, aka differential and co-occurring diagnoses. Determining this is also helpful in studying the cause of the co-occurrence, which we're beginning to find out has a lot of shared underlying genetic risk factors. And if you think about it, this is a huge need. It can be really challenging for clinicians because ADHD can mask autism and autism can mask ADHD. As I said earlier, my ADHD makes me just outgoing enough, but my autism keeps me organized just enough to not seem too scatterbrained or hyperactive. So having a standardized tool to suss that out is very helpful for clinicians. The article goes on to say that the symptoms of overlap between ASD and ADHD can present a diagnostic puzzle for clinicians. I said that. I just said that. Oftentimes, a diagnosis of ASD may be delayed or initially misdiagnosed as ADHD. Furthermore, diagnosis may be even more challenging when ASD and ADHD are co-occurring, which is especially concerning given their high rate of co-occurrence. One critical point for decision-making about differential or co-occurring diagnoses is consideration of the degree of social communication and interaction deficits. We're getting there. Grab your popcorn. While identifying behaviors associated with inattention and hyperactivity or impulsivity or restricted repetitive behaviors are essential to diagnostic decision-making about ADHD and ASD, these behaviors are often clearly distinguishable via clinical interview, assessment, and observation. While the clinician may be tasked with identifying the degree of severity in each of these domains, the presence of significant impairment in either category of symptoms points to a clear diagnostic category. Comparatively, social communication and interaction impairments can be more challenging to objectively categorize in the context of an evaluation, as these behaviors can derive from impairments associated with either ASD or ADHD. Basically, what they're saying here is that it's easy to distinguish restricted or repetitive behaviors for ASD or inattention and hyperactivity for ADHD. Where things get less clear is in that whole social deficits area between the two. So it's not crazy that we're exploring this topic in so much depth in this video. It's a thing. So these researchers dug into this and they hypothesized that the level of social impairments from least to worst would be no diagnosis, then ADHD alone, then ASD alone, and finally they hypothesized that the dual diagnosis of both autism and ADHD would be at the top as most impairing. But that was not what the findings revealed. At the end of their study, they found that youths diagnosed with ASD alone demonstrated the highest level of communication and social interaction deficits, with the comorbidity of both ASD and ADHD falling under that. And last but not least, was that those with ADHD alone or no diagnosis at all showed the lowest level of impairments. But what was most surprising about this last part was that they actually found that the deficits between ADHD only group and the no diagnosis group were indistinguishable. Now, to be fair, it's possible that the no diagnosis group reported an elevation in their own perceived deficits due to the clinical nature of that setting, but this is still really surprising. So their findings were not at all what they expected. And I can understand why the researchers were tempted to think that the dual diagnosis would top the list, because twice the diagnosis, twice the fun, right? But in reality, what was probably happening was that ASD covers up some of the deficits of ADHD and vice versa. And the fact that this study showed ASD superseded the dual diagnosis lines up with all my anecdotal evidence that I went over in the first half of this video. But with all of that said, I'm going to confidently go out on a limb here and say that these findings don't mean the social interaction is easier for those of us with the dual diagnosis. I suspect it just means we might have less reportable traits in a few of these categories, because the fact that I don't lack socially acceptable manners or struggle with understanding social cues or sarcasm is just one less thing for me to report. But it doesn't mean my life is any less impacted by my social communication and interaction challenges. And again, the categories you don't struggle in, if you have the dual diagnosis, might not look exactly the same as mine. But the point is that lacking many of the social differences reported for autism doesn't mean you're not autistic. It just means you might have both, and the traits of one could potentially negate traits of the other. So that's it. Hopefully I'll see you in my next video. A special thanks to Mr. Daydreamer for asking this awesome question. But before I go, if you'd like to support me, you can become a channel member or a subscriber or comment on this video. And if you don't know what to say, feel free to just put a random emoji in the comment section, but make it something really strange and unrelated. You know, like those emojis no one ever uses, like this weird loopy thing, or these arrows in a box, or whatever this strange rope thing is. Point is, commenting anything on my videos helps me out a lot too. All right, until next time, bye for now. Mwah! Y'all need to jump into that time machine and catch up to me here in the future.